Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Tonight we're going to play it slightly differently, and we'll focus our discussion on a recent book that studies attitudes and values within the Indian Army. The book, The Wellington Experience, a study of the attitudes and values within the Indian Army, has been authored by Colonel David Smith of the United States Army, who retired from government service in 2012. The book is published by Stimson Center, a nonpartisan policy research center in Washington, D.C. Colonel Smith, who is with us this evening to discuss the book, is currently a distinguished fellow with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center and an independent consultant to Sandia National Laboratories on issues related to South Asia. But perhaps more relevant to our viewers, Colonel Smith is a graduate of Commandant Staff College, Quetta, and has had a long association with Pakistan Army, including 2 3-year tours as the U.S. Army attaché in Pakistan. We also have with us Lieutenant General Waheed, Arshad, former Chief of General Staff of Pakistan Army, who was commissioned in a cavalry regiment and held various commandant staff appointments during his distinguished military career. So let's get down to business. Colonel Smith, thank you very much for joining us to discuss your book. Since television is usually short on time compared to a book seminar, we have about 30 to 35 minutes to discuss some of the more important findings of the book. So we're looking at some triaging here, unfortunately, I would add. But what I intend to do is to let you give us a quick overview of key findings before we get down to questions with reference to implications for stability in the region, or, as in this case, the lack thereof. So over to you, Colonel Smith.
Thank you, Ejaz. It's a pleasure to be on your show, and I would certainly like to send out a message of greeting to all of my friends from the 1982 staff course in Quetta. So why this book? It was published for 3 reasons. And the first reason, it was always intended to be a companion piece to the Quetta experience. And there's a chapter in the book that compares the 2 schools. Secondly, it's because of the dramatic acceleration in the U.S. and India relationship, particularly since 2014 when Prime Minister Modi became in charge in India. And then finally, because of 3 recent events that occurred in the past year. And I'm referring to the February 2019 terrorist attack at Pulwama and the tit-for-tat airstrikes that flowed from that, the May 2019 re-election of Mr. Modi, and the decisions that he's taking that call into question India's traditional commitment to secular values and democratic practice. And then finally, the 2019 withdrawal of statehood from Jammu and Kashmir and everything that has flowed from that. Basically, the last 4 U.S. presidents have made a big strategic bet on India. So the question that I was trying to get to grips with in this book is this a strategic bet that is warranted? Put another way, is India a reliable asset vis-a-vis China in offsetting the growing economic, military, and political power in China, or is it a strategic millstone? So, as Ejaz mentioned, I have a number of findings in my book. I'll get right into it. The findings are in 5 categories. And the first category, as in the Quetta book, is what I call the Wellington Experience, which is a look at the curriculum, the demographics, and the social issues at the college. Here I found a lot that was the same as at Quetta, but perhaps the most interesting finding was that in an institution that purports to be tri-service and aimed at promoting jointmanship, which is the word that they use at Wellington, the Defense Staff College fails to provide effective joint training. The next area is perception of external threats and friendships. And perhaps the most disappointing finding in the study for me was the high level of mistrust and thinly veiled hostility about the United States that continues to exist in the Indian Army. And of course, this is due mostly to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship over the past 50 years. The intensity of hostility toward Pakistan increased in all 4 decades covered by the study. But the most interesting finding, I think, is concerning China. Though universally perceived as India's main threat, there is a curious reluctance to characterize China as an enemy. And perhaps the reason for this is because there is not the same level of emotive content in the relationship as there is between India and the United States and Pakistan. The third area is perception of internal security threats. Here the book mostly focuses on Kashmir, but it's important to note that there have been 4 long-running insurgencies in India, and that India has never quelled completely any of the 4, although arguably it was much more successful in the Khalistan insurgency of the 1980s. The finding that is of most of interest in the book, however, is that in Jammu and Kashmir, the Indian Army ignores the most basic component of its own subconventional operations doctrine, and that is winning the hearts and minds of the local population. And another finding is that extrajudicial killing of militants is an unspoken feature of the doctrine that is being practiced and applied in Kashmir. The fourth area is about the attitudes toward the state and its institutions. One interesting finding is that military officers in all 3 Indian services are apolitical, and this represents a victory for the founders of India, who saw the British Indian Army as an instrument of colonial oppression and were determined to curb it. In curbing it, right after independence, they moved too far in one direction, and what resulted was an embarrassment by the Indian Army in confronting China in the 1962 war. So what we have seen since then is a de facto social contract between the government and the military. And the contract works something like this. The government gives the Indian Armed Forces complete autonomy institutionally in promotions and other matters of its organization. What it requires in return, however, is that the military is kept at arm's length in major questions involving national security and defense. Anik Mukherjee, an Indian analyst, has written a book about the civil-military relationship, which he categorizes as very dysfunctional. And so I get into the book in a great amount of detail about this. We can talk about it if you wish. Finally, the fifth area is attitudes about nuclear issues. And it's very difficult to actually understand what the attitudes are about these nuclear issues because the DSSC curriculum lacks any meaningful training in nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare, even though in the 1950s and 1960s they had a lot. There seems to be little concern about Pakistan's threat to use tactical nuclear weapons in the event of a future conflict with India. And I find this deeply troubling because the Indian Army is totally unprepared to operate in a nuclear environment. So all of these findings may be of interest, but what does it mean in terms of U.S. policy? And here I come with 4 conclusions and implications for the United States. And the first of these is, despite the warm rhetoric on both sides, India and the United States likely will never become true strategic partners. There's a very thick veneer of what in India is referred to as strategic autonomy. So what we will never see is an alliance relationship between the U.S. and India, although there may be limited cooperation in matters of mutual interest. Second, the situation in Jammu and Kashmir is likely to grow worse over time. The Indian Army has been trying to quell this militancy for the past 30 years, and certainly since 2016, all of its actions in Jammu and Kashmir have only heightened the problems. And this has led to increased tensions over the LOC, and I'm sure General Waheed can talk more clearly about that than I can. Third finding is that in a future war with either China or Pakistan, the Indian Army is likely not to perform as well as it believes it will, for a number of findings in the first area of inquiry. For the United States, in the event of a war between Pakistan and India, it is likely that over time Pakistan would lose. And as long as it stays conventional, that is not a problem for the United States. If India and China go to war, however, the United States is likely there will be tremendous pressure for the United States to intervene on the part of India. and this could create horizontal escalation in other theaters of Asia, particularly in Northeast Asia, that are greatly worrying to the United States. And finally, in a future war with Pakistan, India is very unlikely to understand what Pakistan's nuclear red lines are. And I go into the book in detail to show how each of the three Indian services could inadvertently cross one or more of the red lines that are made deliberately ambiguous as a matter of state policy by Pakistan. I'll stop there, and we can go into any area in which you would like.
Right. Thank for this overview, Colonel Smith, and thank you also for keeping it time sensitive. I can tell the viewers that these findings, if you read the book is very comprehensive in terms of supporting these findings, supporting these implications for India-US relations and also stability or otherwise for the region. General Arshad sir, before I get to Q&A, I'd like to hear your comments on Colonel Smith's main findings, or at least some of them, at least in terms of India, Pakistan, and what kind of syllabi are taught at the Defense Services Staff College, and how does that compare with Command Staff College in Quetta?
Well, thank you, Ejaz. First of all, greetings to Dave. It's been a long time I've heard his voice because of lack of meetings due to Corona. I think it's a wonderful study, as was his study on experiences of Quetta Staff College and in Pakistan. I think it's very objective, it's very realistic, and brings about conclusions which are actually very grounded. And as regards Pakistan-India relations, I think, and he also mentions that in his book probably, that, basically the system has evolved from the British system. The ethos is the same, more or less. The type of training in respective staff colleges, in this case DSSC, is more or less, the framework is the same. The thought process is generally the same. So, I mean, here he mentioned, and he does that in his Quetta study also. What is interesting for me to note is that although he has more experience of interacting with Indian officers, I have less. I have interacted with them only in either in track 1 dialogues over Siachen and Sir Creek, etc., or mostly now in last 8-9 years track 2, and that also at the senior level. I'm surprised that, the last point Dave mentioned about not understanding Pakistan, the sensitivity of the nuclearization of both the countries in terms of their military and strategic thinking, and which obviously translates into strategic and operational planning and execution of war. This is something which is obviously a source of concern, because it is not possible for them not to understand these things. And probably one factor could be that since there is this dysfunctionality between the military and the political decision-making process in terms of, keeping the military away from security matters and planning matters. That could be one of the reasons. But the second reason, I think, is that the Indian Armed Forces senior leadership, I think, does not lay that much stress on this issue because of probably to avoid curtailing the objectives and free-flowing operational planning, and they don't want the liberty of action to be curtailed perhaps at the senior level, and that is why they don't bother too much about it. Although at the same time, they're also looking at the concept of, and vociferously, promoting this concept of limited war under a nuclear overhang. So there's this contradiction in terms of this Indian strategic thinking which Dave has mentioned. Another important, I think, aspect of his study is, this, when he mentions that despite, this is about the Indo-US strategic relationship. It's been now more than 20 years they're going full steam ahead. Despite this $20 billion of, defense purchases and high-tech transfers to India, if the level of hostility continues to be the same or more, And I am not sure where this strategic partnership is going to go in terms of when the conflict worsens, or if it happens, either between India and China or India and Pakistan. And I think this hostility which Dave has mentioned is also partly to do with a typical Hindu culture, if I may say so. It's their suspicion of anything or everything coming from outside is rooted in history, and I think that sort of affects the orientation of officers, population in general, and you will notice it worldwide. You interact with either the Indian diaspora outside India or anywhere else. There is this sort of, lingering suspicion of sort of trying to be not very open in discussing things with people in terms of friendship, in terms of informality. So I think this is that cultural issue. And I would also like to, it's very interesting figures he mentioned in his book about the demography of the Indian military.
Correct.
Now here's this he mentioned the 2011 census, I think. Here's this Muslim population of 14.7 or 14.2%. There is only 0.7% representation in the South College. I mean, this shows that there is something wrong in the system in terms of its grooming, in terms of its opportunities being provided to across the board. Where the six, as he mentioned, is I think 10 times more than the representation at the in the sense in terms of population. So I think this Indian sort of political development, or one might say that evolution of Indian society towards Hindu supremacist orientation or Hindutva politics is also sort of being reflected in terms of opportunities being provided to officers from other ethnicities, in terms of Christians or Muslims and other ethnicities. I mean, this is, otherwise, if everything was all right and the system was functioning properly, there was no issue in terms of demography and opportunities, and the representation of Muslims should have been actually, if not as good as their representation in population, maybe close to it. Yes.
Right. Colonel Smith talks about it in some detail, mentioning the Sacha Committee report also. And that report itself goes, as you know, very deeply into the problem. But let me go back to Colonel Smith. Now, one of the findings that DSSC's pedagogical approach that you argue sharply restricts useful learning and inhibits the development of critical thinking. Those are your words. So that's one. Insufficient attention to jointness, which is actually not the term that they use, but the US military uses. Indian Army's increasing hostility towards Pakistan and the extrajudicial killing of Kashmiris as an unacknowledged feature of Indian Army operations in occupied and now illegally annexed Kashmir. Now, these are the findings that I find, very interesting for our purpose here. There are lots of others too. You mentioned the June 2020 seminar with Indian officers and think tankers, and one area where you had a pushback was on extrajudicial killings in J&K. I'm sure you're aware that only in the last, I think, 3 months, there have been 2 cases of such killings where independent investigators found that Indian Army troops murdered unarmed Kashmiris in cold blood and then declared them armed resistance fighters. So my question to you, Colonel Smith, is what was the pushback about on this issue? Because there is so much empirical evidence, not just by outsiders, but also by Indian rights groups, which have recorded these over a period of, since 1990 when the, when trouble started in J&K.
Well, as I mentioned, there have been 4 long-running insurgencies in India. And one of the attitudes that I found in the Indian Army, or not that I found, but that the students that attended DSSC found, was that the Indians are inordinately fond of saying that they do counterinsurgency much better than the United States. They point to our failures in Vietnam. They point to our initial failures in Iraq before we started to get it right toward the end. And of course, we've never been able to complete the mission in Afghanistan. And they say, well, but we've been doing this for 40 years, long before you, and we do it much better. And the fact, as I told you, is none of these 4 militancies have ever been successfully concluded. And the one in Jammu and Kashmir is the most telling. They've been at it now since 1989. There's no reason to suppose that they're going to do any better than they have in the past. So the pushback that I got was basically from senior military officers who had earlier served in key positions in Jammu and Kashmir. And I would say that if you want to look at the Indian military's attitude toward Jammu and Kashmir, it's sort of a sine wave. There have been times when they have tried to pay lip service and win the hearts and minds of the local populace, and then there have been times when they have not. The pushback that I got was from a senior military officer who retired in 2011. The point that I make in the book repeatedly is that after 2016, there was an inflection point, and it involved the death of this man, Burhan Wani. And ever since the last 4 years, the attitude toward counterinsurgency in Jammu and Kashmir has been harsh and punitive, and there has been little effort to try to win the hearts and minds of the local population. The use of pellet shotguns is one manifestation of this. There's a famous incident where an Indian Army officer tied a Kashmiri to the front of his Jeep so that people wouldn't pelt him with stones. And then he received a commendation for this from the Chief of Army Staff in New Delhi. In terms of extrajudicial killing, this has been going on for a very long period of time. And the students at the Defense Services Staff College were very candid with the American students about this. They generally would say that when a militant is picked up and thrown in the local jail, he's given a certain amount of time, and if after that certain amount of time has passed, no family members have come to claim him, that's treated as prima facie evidence that he's an infiltrator from Pakistan. He's taken out of the jail and then never seen again. Whether this extrajudicial killing is done by the local police, the Rashtriya Rifles, is not further determined. But it does exist, and it continues to exist.
Right. This is another corroboration of what the rights groups have been saying for a long time. Now, with reference to strategic partnership with India and the question whether it's an asset or a millstone, given recent skirmishes with the PLA in eastern Ladakh, and given what the American students have told you about what happened with the DCCS, how well prepared or otherwise do you think the Indian Army is in confronting the PLA? And I want you to situate this response to this in the lack of jointness that you mentioned as one of the key findings in terms of how the officers are trained and groomed.
Well, first of all, if you take a look at the exercises, the tactical exercises that are conducted at Wellington, there are a number of them in mountain warfare, and these inevitably are done with an opponent that resembles China. The problem is they are generally small-scale exercises involving nipping off a piece of territory by the Chinese-like adversary, and then the operations in order to eject them from this. Typically, we're talking about battalion and brigade level operations. So for the past 7 or 8 years, the Indian Army has recognized that it has a major problem along the line of actual control, and it has started to build large forces to increase the size of the Indian Army to deal with the situation. They've tried to raise a mountain strike corps, for example. There have been problems in doing this from a personnel standpoint, from an equipment standpoint. But the problem that I see at DSSC is that none of this is reflected in the curriculum. They continue to have these small exercises instead of wargaming what would be a much larger confrontation with China. So the other thing to point out, and in answer to your question, is that this is a very Army-centric analysis of the situation. Very little integration with the Air Force. And that's the problem. There's very little day-to-day integration between the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force. Both of them have different institutional requirements, different institutional priorities. And it's also important, and here's another area where I got a ton of pushback on the Indian side. I made the observation that the Indian Army has not been involved, in high-intensity combat since at least 1971.
Correct.
And I got a lot of pushback because they say, well, we've been fighting in Kashmir for 30 years. And I really had to go back and rethink how I addressed this in the book. And so what I mean by high-intensity combat is combat against an adversary that is equally well-armed and equipped, combat that involves close cooperation with at least one other service. In this case, it would be the Indian Air Force. And finally, a level of operations that go on for an extended period of time that require robust logistics support. None of these three things do I see in the Indian military.
Right. In fact, one of the things that you write in the book, and it's quite fascinating, that the three services syndicates will look at their end of the operational problem and make the presentation separately, and then try and bring this in. So there's not really, I won't even call it coordination, much less jointness. But another issue that you talk about, and you've talked about this earlier also on this program, civilian control by civilian principles. But there's also a sense of dissatisfaction of the Indian Army top brass with civilian bureaucracy. You have in fact quoted in the book former Indian Army Chief V.P. Malik as saying that although the military is committed to civil supremacy, it remains dissatisfied with a secondary role in strategic decision making. But here's my sense of, as an observer, that there is evidence that Indian Army has a virtual carte blanche in occupied Kashmir, and it has effectively thwarted civilian governments on an agreement on Siachen, for instance. It seems to me that it has found effective workarounds within decision-making circles. Do you think that you would agree with that sense?
I write about it in the book. And what I say in the book is that the civil-military relationship, the de facto social contract that I mentioned, is in the process of evolution. And one of the areas in which that is most manifested is in Jammu and Kashmir, in which the Army has an inordinate amount of policy supremacy. And you rightly point out that on 3 occasions the Indian Army was responsible for a failure to reach an agreement on Siachen. We had a visitor in Washington a couple of years back from Kashmir who made a statement that most of the people that I talked with would agree with, and that is the Corps commander in Srinagar exercised more power than even the chief minister of the state. The Army is able to operate with virtual impunity under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. I point out again in the book that that act really has some scope for the trial of Indian Army soldiers that exceed their mandate. And on 50 occasions, the state of Jammu and Kashmir has requested that they be prosecuted. Yet not one time has the Ministry of Defense acceded in allowing them to be punished under civil laws. And even in the one case in which there's been a court-martial against a couple of Indian soldiers for what amounts to war crimes, that was set aside by an armed forces tribunal, and they really suffered no punishment. So yes, I agree. In this particular area, the Indian Army is outside the norm of the civil-military relationship.
Right. I have a couple of other questions before I wrap this up, but let me go back to General Arshad. General Arshad, given this discussion and given obviously your own experience as a practitioner, as the former Chief of General Staff, this mindset, this approach, what do you think are the stability implications of this in the region?
Well, Ejaz, I'm not sure whether the Indian mindset or as Dave has put it in his book, this increasing hostility towards Pakistan, I think it's a reflection of how the Indian society has evolved over the years, especially under the Modi regime. And now you find Indian society generally very, very anti-Pakistan, especially the Hindu majority. And when you look at the repression in the illegally annexed Jammu and Kashmir, and if you link it with what happened at post Pulwama, the Balakot strikes, and how the security situation was used politically for political gains, shows actually either a total disregard of the environment, political military environment, or lack of understanding. It's amazing the way they went about it. Had it not been for Pakistan's efforts to de-escalate, things would have gone perhaps somewhere else. That is number one. Number two, despite the dysfunction or the apprehension of the Indian military towards civilian bureaucracy, and they always make this point. I am not very I don't buy this to an extent to which they propagate it. I think Indian military has now a great influence on political policy making. This Balakot strike would not have happened had the military not been totally on board, knowing the repercussions of it. The situation in the illegally annexed Jammu and Kashmir would not have been perhaps this bad if politics had been allowed to intervene, as Dave says, in winning hearts and minds. I'm not, and that links me, influences me to link the situation of J&K, that if it was a Hindu majority area with the same kind of situation of, trying to win, throw off the Indian government yoke and things like that, and would the Indian army would have been doing those human rights violations and repression the same way they've been doing now in the Muslim majority area? These are the questions which actually calls into question the professional approach of the Indian military, really.
Right. No, without prejudice to what you're saying, I think the point that Colonel David Smith makes, and interestingly, there is another very good book by a former Indian Army officer who's now an academic, Aneet Mukherjee. It's called The Absent Dialogue. It came out last year. There are structural reasons for this, control by the civilian bureaucracy. But of course, that's a completely different topic and not part of our discussion right now. But Colonel Smith, Waheed Yusuf, who's now our national security advisor, he wrote his book on brokered bargaining, and he studied 3 crises. Now, if we look at the U.S. approach to India and increasing partnership with India, in the event of a conflict, do you think that Pakistan will look at the United States as, I shan't say an honest broker, but an effective broker? It seems to me that it'll be difficult for Pakistan to consider the U.S. in that role, which, and when I say this, I do realize the irony of it, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of hostility towards the United States within the Indian Army also.
Well, I point out in one of my implications that the United States probably has far less influence with Pakistan than it did in the days after 9/11. I point out the problems along the line of control in 2003, when the United States helped play a positive role in coming to an agreement on a ceasefire along the line of control. And in 2004, the number of incidents fell down to below half a dozen. I don't think because of the way our relationship has progressed after the awful events of 2011, and I think most of you understand what I mean about that, that the U.S. has the same level of influence. That said, the United States will exercise diplomatic influence to the best of its ability. Whether or not Pakistan accepts that influence is up to Pakistan. I just do not see that we have the same level that we did prior to 2011.
Right. One final question before I wrap this up. You talk about the army being apolitical. You also talk about a certain secular culture within the army. But there is the issue of this rising sort of wave or groundswell, if you will, of the Hindutva ideology. Increasing numbers of very senior Indian officers joining the BJP after retirement. There's also serving officers. There have been incidents, at least 2 or 3 that I can think of, serving officers being on the same platform for a seminar as other right-wing elements. So what is your sense of how, because the acculturation process within the military academy and then onwards as the officer proceeds, further into his career, that this acculturation process is going to come under tremendous pressure if you are getting recruitment from areas where you see a groundswell of Hindutva ideology.
Well, every military organization from whatever country reflects the society from which it springs. By finding that the officer corps in India is apolitical and that there was no evidence of adherence to Hindutva or radical Hindu nationalism, I leave at the end of the book in my section on concluding thoughts as something that needs to be watched in the future. Now, I will point out that in 2014 and again and presumably in 2019, that there were many people in Wellington among the student body that were all for Mr. Modi, but not because of his commitment to Hindu nationalism. They were for Mr. Modi because he was perceived as being tougher on Pakistan than Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who was perceived within the military as being too weak on Pakistan. So that's a difference. But you rightly point out that since Mr. Modi has been in power, there have been efforts to perhaps subconsciously politicize the Indian Armed Forces. Certainly, the decision of his government to hold them up as, the example of selfless devotion to service is something that we have not seen any government in India do. So whether or not this apolitical nature of the Indian Army Officer Corps can be maintained in the future is an open question, and I leave it as an open question in the book.
I agree with you. But thank you so much. That was Colonel David O. Smith speaking with us. There's a lot more in the book that needed to be discussed, but as I said in my opening, time on television is always very short. Thank you also to Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad for his comments. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the possible second wave of COVID-19 in Pakistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. We now move to a statement by Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, Asad Omar, who said that marriage halls and restaurants were becoming main sources for the spread of COVID-19. This is presumably another spike and needs to be controlled. We have with us Dr. Kamran, who is a health and policy expert. Let's get straight to Dr. Qureshi on this. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're witnessing a spike, and we're also headed towards winter, and with it, the problem of smog. So how do we intend to control this, or more appropriately, how should we control it, if at all?
So I'll just come to the point. Yes, we are going to see another surge coming up. And right now, I have been receiving calls from various places. People who have not gone out of the houses for the last 6-7 months. Even those people have gotten corona sitting in their houses. So if you just look at it, it's the corona is not gone. I wrote an article recent past, and one thing which I wrote down was that you have to make COVID-19 another one of the disease, and you have to treat it as a disease. You cannot shy away from it, and you cannot say that it'll go away.
So we cannot let one of the findings, obviously, what you're saying is that we're not supposed to let our guards down. But in terms of treating it, I assume that at this stage, in terms of our knowledge, now we still, we still do not have a vaccine for it, but in terms of treatment, I'm assuming that we are much better informed at this point than we were when it began here. Is that assumption correct?
I totally agree with you. And quoting back what we wrote in our 2 articles, myself and another colleague of mine, a pulmonologist, we wrote down. At that time, we had very scarce data with us. Today, we are in a much better position because the data has improved. We can see that in Pakistan, luckily, alhamdulillah, things have been not that virulent, and we have not seen as many deaths as were being projected at that time. So right now, the current position is that if we lower our guards, we are going to go into a problem again, which we cannot let it happen, because so far we have done a very good job. And whether we have done it or Allah Ta'ala has been kind towards Pakistan, so we cannot lower our guards, because if this time we get into a problem, it's going to be a bigger problem, because we do not have the quarantines, we do not have the lock position.
Right. Now, as a professional who has been obviously looking at this, observing it closely, writing about this, would you advise the governments, and I say governments because obviously the provincial governments and also the federal government, in terms of another perhaps 2-week lockdown in order to sort of quell it at this stage?
In my own personal opinion, I would not be going for a lockdown, but I would be definitely saying that we need to go with a more strict SOPs being followed, and that's what we are lacking right now. I wouldn't be an advocate for lockdown at this position, but yes, we have to, as a nation and as the government as well, we need to see all the public places which are there. We need to ensure that the SOPs are being followed. SOPs should be ensured rather than going for a lockdown.
I agree with you. Ideally, there should be that kind of self and social discipline, but unfortunately, what we've observed is that you don't find that discipline even among the educated and the upper strata of society. As far as the lower strata are concerned, obviously, there are other reasons why people cannot have social distancing, why they perhaps cannot have other precautions. So then it boils down to enforcement, and enforcement is obviously a very difficult part of it. So I'm assuming that perhaps some kind of lockdown would be better than just leaving it to the people to become self-disciplined.
I think which you're saying that bigger areas like the wedding halls and other places where there are more people being gathered in one place, that needs to be checked or needs to be closed down for a little while more. Now, the economic repercussions of that, that is a different thing altogether. But if you look at it, restaurants, again, we cannot let the economy, because we have a very frail economy over here. So I would say, again, that lockdown may not be the solution, but strict enforcement implementation, that is what is needed. And as a nation, we may not be able to do that, until and unless the regulators are strong enough that they're able to ensure that.
That's a big thank you so much. That was Dr. Kamran Qureshi speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.